Welcome into our Sunday Night Live at 5. Today we're going to be talking about vulnerability, why it is the new flex, right? Why is this a superpower? So we're going to discuss a couple things. We're going to talk about why vulnerability means authenticity, why it means, what is vulnerability, what is vulnerability not? Because we see a lot of people saying, well, I'm being vulnerable with you. And in all actuality, they're not being vulnerable because they're not discerning when to be vulnerable. There is a big difference. So we're going to say, what is vulnerability? What is it not? Why do people refuse to be vulnerable in relationships? Because if we refuse to be vulnerable, we're never going to cultivate an actual good relationship. And then we'll talk about what vulnerability actually does for a relationship, because we want to be vulnerable. I think all of us have that craving to connect to people on that level, but we also have a lot of fear in us and a lot of things that keep us from doing that, and it keeps us from having healthy relationships. Okay. I will start referencing back to emotional availability in a couple of these sections. When we talk about a vulnerability, I'll tell you why this means that you're not being emotionally available at the same time. And I'll also reference emotional intelligence. So, why emotionability is seen as a strength these days is because if you look at the trend on all social medias, we went from, 5 years ago, social media was filled with look at my life, look at all this amazingness, look at all this, right? And we've made a shift overall. I'm not saying that all accounts do this, but we've made a shift in social media to where we're having more of the honest conversations. We're talking about honest things. We are showing, for fitness influencers, there's been, there's still people that fake everything, right? They show this wonderful life that they're leading as a fitness coach when in reality they're struggling to make ends meet. They're working 4 or 5 jobs, but yet they're posting that they're living this crazy lifestyle. Look at my abs and all of these things. And we've shifted from that into content creators showing you pictures where they're showing this is what I look like in staged photos and this is what I look like normally, and their guts hanging out and stuff, right? Because in actuality, when we talk about the body, like I have a six pack, I have big arms. Problem is, when I sit down, I look like I got rolls like a fat person. Okay, and that's being vulnerable, saying, "Look, I have this about me that I don't necessarily like, but I'm showing it to you because it's real." Right? And Instagram and Facebook and even TikTok at times has become more real in that sense that people are tired of seeing that kind of fake lifestyle, which that means it's being inauthentic. And that being said, that is the reverse of being vulnerable. When you are not vulnerable, you're not showing yourself parts of yourself. You're trying to armor up in a way, and it's being inauthentic. So as we have this shift in social media trying to be more authentic, we realize that the way to do that is to be more vulnerable. And for those of you that know my story, know that I share parts of my story that are painful for me to even talk about at times. And I do that not because I want to get anything from you, but what I want that to do is to spur you on into the growth that you're looking for today, right? Because if you think and know it can be done, you're going to go out and do it. We have an example of that. Roger Bannister, the first person to ever run a mile under 4 minutes, right? People told him you'll never be able to do it. No one's ever done it. No one will ever do it, right? And then he goes out and does it. He's the first man to do it. He runs under 4 minutes. And what happens? We have like a multitude. I think it was like 60 some people ran the mile in the next year that followed that. 60 some people did it. Why did they do that then? Why did no one do it and then suddenly everybody's doing it? Well, because somebody showed it could be done, then they all want to do it. So when I share my story vulnerably, I'm doing it from a place of saying, look, it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to stand in this space where you're not sure if that you're going to be accepted or not. And it's okay to do that because what's the worst that's going to happen? Right? And this is what healing looks like when you are able to be vulnerable and not fear any of those rejections or abandonment or anything with it. And I always go back when it talks about, authenticity and I talk about vulnerable. I use an example from the movie 8 Mile. If you've ever seen the movie, there's a bunch of rap battles in there. I got it. At the end of the very end of the movie, he has a rap battle with Papa Doc, and he gets to go first. And in that minute and a half that he has to, rap about his, what's going on, and kind of because rap battles are all about kind of punking the other person, right? He goes on to say, I already know what you're going to say about me. I am a bum. I am white trash. He says all these things about him. I do live in a trailer with my mom, right? What are you going to say about me? And that is being honest and open and vulnerable and authentic to who you are and saying, you can't use it against me. And when you finally get to that point where you do not fear the rejection or abandonment, you will be able to speak of your life in a vulnerable sense and not fear what's coming. Okay. So when we get into vulnerability and what it is, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But we're living in a time where these masks that we have on are out. That's why content creators are being more vulnerable with what they do. All right, you see these reels, a day in the life of, and these guys are getting out there and showing you how boring their life really is and how hard they're actually grinding. They're not just showing you the successes that they're having and, oh my gosh, look at this amazing lifestyle. The mask is off. We're showing people behind the scenes a little bit more, right? And this world has been saturated with these like curated identities, and I think that society has become disgusted by it, and that's why we're making this shift. Emotional health has become forefront. We're talking to men saying you can be vulnerable. There's actually more strength in vulnerability because, again, just as Eminem did, when we can say, I know what you're going to say about me and I don't care, that is strength. Strength is not in hiding it behind a wall. Strength is saying, this is my weakness and you can't use it against me. I already know that it's a weakness, right? When a bully makes fun of you and you're like, oh, okay, cool, yeah. I talk about it with my ears all the time. You guys can't see it because I have headphones on, but I have really big ears. Been made fun of my entire life, but I don't let that affect me because, yes, it is a self-conscious thing about me, but I'm not fearing that you're going to reject me because of my ears. And if you do, there's something wrong with you, not something wrong with me. That's how I start viewing my vulnerabilities. So we're making this shift from armored up people to authenticity. And that's where we're at right now. So, what is vulnerability? Okay, I want to define it. You guys know I love to define the thing that we're going to talk about. So, what is vulnerability? Vulnerability is the willingness to let people see the parts of you that you're not guaranteed to be accepted. Your fears, your needs, your insecurities, your desires, your truth. And I could speak to each one of those. Your fears. You don't want to tell somebody that you fear abandonment because then you're afraid they're going to use it against you, right? You don't want to tell them your needs because it makes you look needy or feel needy, right? You don't want to tell them your insecurities because you don't want them to now notice it more than anything. If I tell someone, think I got really big ears, now they can't unsee it, right? Those things about us that we don't want to say because we're afraid they're not going to be accepted. Okay. And so that's what the definition of vulnerability really is. And when it comes to like desires or truth, we don't want to tell the truth because we're afraid that they're going to leave us if we tell them what's really going on. Right? Or they're going to think less of us, or they're not going to accept us, or they're not going to, they're going to keep us on that pedestal that they've always had us on. All of those fears are real, but they are all in our head because if that person was going to leave, holding the truth back from them is not going to not make them leave. They're still eventually going to leave your life. You're just prolonging the pain at that point. And I get it. We don't want the pain, but it's going to happen sooner or later. If you hide something from somebody, the truth always comes out, right? So, what is vulnerability? If we had to take the definition and now say, like, what kind of actions does that look like? Sharing honestly when you don't know the outcome, right? Meaning, I'm going to tell you a truth about me, and I may be rejected for it. You may even walk away from me if I say this, but I need to say it because it is who I am. When we try to hide that, that is not what vulnerability. That's the opposite of vulnerability, right? Another action is saying, I love you first, even if you're not sure it will be said back. That's a vulnerable moment. That's a very vulnerable moment. Now, I know somebody's going to be like, well, what about narcissists? They do it on purpose. Well, yeah, let's take them out of this. Let's just talk about you and I as healed people, right? When we talk about loving someone first and we say it first, that's vulnerable because we're putting ourselves out there in a manner that says, I'm willing to tell you how I'm really feeling it, the real emotion behind all of it, okay? Another vulnerability is admitting I was wrong instead of defending yourself, right? There's a lot of strength. And I always say that I can respect somebody more when they raise their hand and say, I screwed up and I am sorry that I put you in that position. Rather than saying, well, if you'd been in my position, you would have done the same thing. It doesn't matter. But knowing what we know now, being able to say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it to come off that way, is got much more strength because if you can acknowledge your weaknesses, you're a much stronger person. When you have that awareness, you're a much stronger person. You're dangerous, if you will, because you know what you can and can't do. You know your limits and capabilities. I cannot respect someone that does not know their limits and capabilities and tries to always go above and beyond for everything. There's more respect for someone that says, I was wrong. Asking for help instead of pretending you're okay. right? That is a real world scenario of what vulnerability is. Okay. So we think about it, it's sharing honestly when we think we might be judged. Who cares? Let's just share anyways. Saying I love you first. So expressing an emotion first before somebody else does to see, even though we think we might be rejected. Admitting our faults is a vulnerability, and asking for help, like not wanting to feel weak, if you will. Okay. So some more real world examples, saying things like I'm struggling, telling a friend you're hurt by their joke instead of just laughing it off and trying to act like it didn't hurt you. Asking for a need to be met before it becomes resentment. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But being vulnerable actually stems off resentment, because when we harbor emotions and we do not express those emotions, they typically always come out as a resentment somewhere in the relationship. They Emotion gets expressed, but when we try to suppress it, it typically comes out as one of the negative emotions we don't like. It comes out as anger, comes out as resentment, comes out as a lot of passive aggressive behaviors, things like that, because we're suppressing the real emotion that's behind it, because we have a fear of being vulnerable, because we think if we're vulnerable and we tell them what's really going on, right, we end up getting, hurt when they leave us. So that means that we have an inverse to it. So if that's what vulnerability is, now we're going to talk about what vulnerability is not. Vulnerability is actually very, very powerful, but it's very often misunderstood. To use it well, we have to clear up that confusion around it. And the first thing I'll say is vulnerability needs the context of what type of relationship that you're in with a person to know if vulnerability is actually a good thing. So we have to have the emotional intelligence and awareness, right, to know when it's time to share. Vulnerability is not oversharing, right? Oversharing and very intimate type details about your life or heavy information without considering the emotional safety, timing, or the depth of the relationship is not at all vulnerability. What that is you trying to mask your need for connection. So it's not necessarily that you don't share details. You're not sharing the real detail that's behind it, right? Your desire for connection. Like, I really want to feel connected to you. Instead of saying that, we state all these vulnerable details, thinking if they just accept me, then see, I've been vulnerable, they accepted me, and I'm good, right? That's not healthy. What we need to do is express what's really going on behind it. We do this all the time with, people when they have behaviors that are bad. We have to look for the childhood root. Here is the root. The root is I'm struggling for connection, so I'm oversharing in an attempt to get you to connect to me, right? So do not overshare, because it does not equate vulnerability. Because if you're not sharing the intimate detail of why you're sharing and oversharing, you're not actually being vulnerable. What you're doing is trying to mask it behind something else. And it always typically backfires, right? So an example of this in the real world is when, like, you get to know somebody, right? And you go on a first date and you're sharing like the worst childhood trauma that you've ever been through in the first 15 minutes of this very first date. Yeah, you guys have connected a little bit. You've texted online and stuff like that, and you've texted by phone. Maybe even had a FaceTime phone call before you got to a date. But you get on that date, and first 15 minutes, you're already sharing, I was abused sexually by my father, and all this happens. And that typically, when we do it that way, this is why it backfires, because it's going to put that person off and say, wow, this person's got a lot of baggage. We all have the same amount of baggage. I want to be clear about that right now. However, it makes you look needy, and it makes you look desperate for connection at that point. And the human body's nervous system can sense that. And what ends up happening is the other person's like, I don't know about this person. They've shared too much stuff with me. And it becomes a burden, it feels like, to be in a relationship with that type of person. So we don't overshare, right? We want to be vulnerable and say, I have, you can be vulnerable, and vulnerability needs to be like not like an on off switch, but like a dimmer switch. We need to start with small things. Tell them you have a very, abusive past, and you're not ready to talk about it. That's being vulnerable a little bit, to see how they relate to it, to see how they react to it. And then once we've trusted them with, hey, I've had an abusive childhood, then we slowly give them the details over time. That's a way of doing it in a very healthy and vulnerable way. But we can't just trust them with our vulnerability right off the bat. We have to be a little more reserved with it, right? right? So vulnerability respects the context of that relationship. It considers the relationship depth before it goes ahead and share. That's why emotional intelligence is important before we try to get into a relationship, because if I don't know when and how to be vulnerable, I am emotionally dysregulated at that point. I am not regulating my emotions to know that vulnerability is not appropriate in this situation, okay? Now, another confusion is that vulnerability equals weakness. We've been conditioned to equate openness with fragility, right? But it actually takes more strength to risk being seen than to hide behind a stoic mask. Crying doesn't mean that you're falling apart. It's saying I'm not okay. And we think that if we're not okay, someone's not going to want us. When in actuality, the realness of that will actually draw other people in typically, right? It won't draw in the right people, but it will draw in the right people that see you're hurting, want to give you the empathy. When we try to hide behind it, we wonder why that person had no empathy. We gave them nothing to be empathetic towards at that point. But it's not a weakness. Weakness is avoiding the truth, trying to lie, trying to manipulate, trying to cheat, trying to steal, trying to do things like that is very, very weak, because you don't have the strength to be able to say, what's really going on. We see this in the dating world all the time, that like we end up ghosting someone because we don't want to tell them the truth, right? So again, weakness is avoiding the truth. Vulnerability is confronting that truth with whoever it is without fear. Well, you may still have the fear, but without having to judge it based on the outcome of what is said to that person. We don't care if they reject us. We don't care if they abandon us. We still fear it, but we just don't care about the outcome. That's when vulnerability hits, right? Vulnerability is not needing constant validation, right? When we do this, when we try to share intimate details so we can gain pities and different things like that, right? We want somebody to respond to our emotions in a certain way. And that when we tie our self-worth to how somebody responds to our emotions, and we're vulnerable for that case, we're not being vulnerable. We're outsourcing our identity to somebody else. We're saying, I think this hurts me. Oh, you think it hurts me? So I'm okay. Yeah, so it hurts me, right? And that's not vulnerability in any way, shape, or form. Vulnerability says, here is my truth, not please approve me. And when we're sharing intimate details from a place of, I need you to approve that this happened, that it hurt me, that I'm valid for thinking this way, that's seeking approval, not standing in your truth. Okay. And there's a difference between sharing to connect and sharing to be rescued. And without knowing it, if we're trying to be vulnerable in an essence to have somebody see and hear us so that they come to our rescue, then we're doing it to be rescued. And that's not healthy. And so when we start looking at the patterns of how we've been as a person, if we realize that every time we've been vulnerable, we're hoping that they will suddenly be the person that changes that story for us, whether it be they change how they treat us because they see how bad we've hurt, then we're not being vulnerable. The truth is that happened. Not that I expect you to change any of that in my past or rewrite my story because of that. Okay, so it's very, very critical that we look at our patterns and we look to see, are we doing this for validation, for approval, so to speak? Vulnerability is not emotional manipulation. Some people typically will weaponize, right, this, disclosing information to people in order to gain sympathy, to guilt others, or to dodge accountability, right? An example of this is, I'm so damaged, you really can't blame me. After everything I've been through, I just can't do this, or I can't do that. That is a vulnerability as a way of trying to manipulate somebody into pitying you, essentially, and not allowing you to feel the accountability for your actions. Okay, so it's very important that we understand that if we use vulnerability as a weapon to gain something from somebody else, that is manipulation. Anytime you're doing anything as a way of trying to get somebody to do something, if that ever enters your mind, if I do this, then they'll do this for me, it's manipulation. And it can even look like healthy manipulation, right? People are like, well, I'm doing it because if I love them enough, they're going to love me back. That's manipulation. You are trying to tie the outcome into what you're doing. You're trying to do something to prompt a result from the other person. That is manipulation. If you want love from somebody, you can't just love them into loving you. Okay, so vulnerability is very much the same thing. When we actually use it to try to prompt a result from somebody, we are manipulating them at that point. True vulnerability takes ownership. It says, this is what I feel, not this is why I deserve exemption from my responsibility. Okay, so Now that we know what vulnerability is and we know what vulnerability isn't, why what real vulnerability does for a relationship then? Like how does this all work in a relationship? What does it do for us? And why are we starting to push more towards that as a society? Well, if we think of give me a second here, I need some coffee. If we think of vulnerability like as something outside of being just a word, let's use an analogy here. Vulnerability is the soil in which authentic connection grows. Without it, you don't have intimacy, you have performance, right? So there are things that true vulnerability is going to start fostering, right? The first thing it's going to do is it's going to build emotional safety. When one person opens up, they model emotional risk taking. Okay. And risk taking is where things get built. We've got to take risks. You can't, they always say you can't make money without spending money. You got to take a risk in order to get something back. When we are vulnerable, we are opening up and we're saying, I'm risk taking here with you. And that signals it's safe to be human here, right? So when I'm vulnerable about something that I'm self-conscious about, right? It's going to make the other person, oh, I can completely understand it. It allows the connection right there. It's saying I'm safe. You can tell me what yours is, because more than likely I'll at least have empathy for whatever it is that you struggle with in your self-consciousness. So I'm literally being the Roger Bannister saying it's okay. I've run the mile in under 4 minutes, so you can do it too. And that's what and that builds that safety right there, saying I'm a safe person to be able to communicate with. Okay. So, some more examples of this is like telling your partner, I get scared when I don't hear from you. That's inviting a soft, compassionate dialogue, whereas accusing them of you never care. You never text me, so you never care, which is a projecting response, right? Is not being vulnerable. You're not telling them why, right? We're just telling them you never care, right? And that leads to defensiveness. So emotional safety puts up this kind of like a handshake, saying, shake my hand. And when we do that, it eliminates their defensiveness and they want to shake our hand back. When we offer defensiveness, we're offering a fist. Okay. So again, emotional safety and being vulnerable is an open handshake, and saying, being defensive is a fist, right? If we imagine it like that, we can see that us being vulnerable is a shit handshake with that other person, and it's going to get them to shake your hand. You put up your fist, they're going to put up their fist, and now we're in a bad posture at that point. Okay, so it builds emotional safety. Now it's going to deepen intimacy. Like, how can anyone expect to be fully loved if you don't fully show up, right? And if you justify it with a fear, well, that fear is coming into reality because of your action, not because of the what could or could not happen. You're going to end up manifesting it by not being vulnerable and saying, well, they could leave, right? So if we want to be fully loved, we have to be fully vulnerable. Again, it does not mean that it's an on-off switch. We have to have some context and let it grow through time. But we cannot be like, well, I just can't be vulnerable because they have to love me first. Love comes after the vulnerability. We can't even display love if you don't display all the bad parts about you, I cannot display that I'm willing to love them. And then when they come out later, now it's a surprise, it's a bait and switch on me. So if as we start to gain that, right, when we start to gain that intimacy by sharing vulnerable details, seeing that they're not going anywhere, it then builds more emotional safety and relaxes me and allows me to open up. And I feel like I have a bond with that person that I would not be able to have if I wasn't vulnerable like that. Okay. Vulnerability is what turns those like surface level connections into those deep emotional soul level bonds that we all kind of crave and desire. Even the people that say they don't desire it, they don't crave it, they don't want it, they still crave it. Our souls are designed that way by God. Okay. So an analogy here is love without vulnerability is like a locked door with the lights on inside. It looks warm, but you're not really invited in. Okay. So love can be there, but it's not true love until we've invited somebody into the dark parts of us too that are inside of us. Right. So we have to be intimate, and to be intimate, we have to have vulnerability. You cannot actually have intimacy without that. Intimacy is the act of being close to somebody despite any of the bad things about them. If I don't tell you the bad things about me, how can you be close to me? that at that point we are at a paradox of you can't be one without the other, essentially. Okay. Now, it's going to build trust through truth. Pretending, posturing, deflecting creates emotional fog. It's going to confuse that other person. Your actions a lot of times won't line up with your words when you're like, I'm okay, but then you don't text them back for like 8 hours and you try to blame it on work. Anybody can see through that it's not work. When you're typically responding, say, back and forth in text, right? And then they're like, is everything okay? And you're like, yeah, everything's fine. I'm okay. But then you don't respond for 8 hours when typically on most days you do. That's already signaling to them that your actions and your words aren't lining up. And it makes it hard for somebody's nervous system to trust what you're doing. But if you were to say, I'm not okay, but I'm just not ready to talk about it, that's vulnerable. That's honest. That's emotionally available, as we've talked about in the past. The when you're not vulnerable, you're not being emotionally available because you're not being honest with the truth that is inside of you. And if the truth is, I'm not having a good day right now and I just don't want to talk, then you say that. That is the emotionally available response, and that is the vulnerable response, right? But a lot of people don't want to do that because they fear the conversation that comes afterwards. But you don't have to have a conversation afterwards if you preface it with what you're feeling. I don't want to have a conversation. The vulnerable thing to say is, I'm not doing okay, but I don't want to talk about it. That's the vulnerable thing to say, right? And that's the emotionally available thing to say at the same time. So by doing that, though, it's going to create more of a healthy trust, right? Vulnerability clears the air by naming the truth, even when it is messy. That honesty creates reliability and trust over time. An example of this is saying, I'm afraid I'll mess this up. That's going to build more trust than pretending to have it all together with somebody, right? And when you're not authentic, people will put you on this pedestal. So when you do screw up, it's not going to be right. But if you're vulnerable right off the bat and you tell them like, these are my shortcomings, these are my mistakes, they're like, okay, I can understand that. And they don't put you on a pedestal. But when you're like, oh, I'm perfect with this and I'm perfect with this and I'm perfect with this, and you look that way because you're not being vulnerable, when you do actually have a mistake that gets seen by them, we're gonna erode all of that trust right there, right? Because again, our words and actions aren't going to line up. It's going to create a disconnect in that person's brain, and we're going to have a really hard time recovering from something like that. The next thing that it does is it reduces resentment. This is a big one, right? Unspoken needs grow into silent expectations, and unmet expectations become resentment. Vulnerability stops that cycle by putting the truth on the table early and often. Okay? Resentment is one of the things that kills a lot of relationships. And typically, I will say it's not even the resentment. It's just miscommunication or uncommunicated expectations, needs, wants, desires, things like that, which when we talked about at the beginning, vulnerability is the ability to state our desires, needs, wants, all of those things without fear of what's going to come out of it. So if I don't do that, I'm going to be like, they should be doing this for me, but I'm not going to communicate it. So I'm expecting them to do something that they don't even have the knowledge to do. I use the analogy of that's like having, let's say we're in a TV sitcom together and you come to the set and I don't give you your lines, and then we go out on set and try to talk through the stuff, and I'm mad at you because you don't know your lines. If I didn't give you the script that I was supposed to give you, then how do I expect you to know the lines that you have to have? So if I don't communicate my needs, wants, desires, all of those things, then I'm now expecting somebody to perform in a way that they don't even know they're supposed to perform. So as we don't communicate things, it ends up creating resentment, especially around needs. When people like try to suppress their needs and say it makes me feel weak, we are now creating that resentment. We are creating the problem of them not meeting our needs. They're not meeting our needs because they're not meeting our needs, but it's not because they don't necessarily want to. But then in our head, we create this narrative that they don't want to meet our needs because they're not meeting them, when it was my job to communicate it in the first place. So I'm going to blame them for my lack of vulnerability at that point. Again, I'm not giving them the script on how to love me right. I have to do that. We can't expect people this day and age. I could take 10 men, 10 women, and ask them all of their expectations of how somebody should act in different scenarios. And every single person on both sides will answer wrong. I have 20 different answers on how people will expect people. They may look similar, but overall, there'll be 20 different answers on how somebody's supposed to act in different situations. And that means that, okay, well, I'll give you a perfect example. I've dated multiple women over my life. I've been married twice. Both of the marriages viewed February 14th, Valentine's Day, very, very differently. And so if you just expect this person to put the same gravity on Valentine's Day that you do, or not put Valentine's Day, we're going to end up in a disconnect here. Because he's going to be like, well, the last two women I dated said that no woman likes this. And now you're telling me that every woman likes this. What am I supposed to do? You're putting that person at a disadvantage, and you're going to resent them for something that they didn't even know in the first place. So we have to be able to communicate these things, because if we do communicate that vulnerability, even if it makes us feel weak, it's going to create that intimacy. It's going to diminish all of this resentment. It's going to stand in that truth and build trust with that person. Again, unspoken needs ends up into, silent expectations, and those unmet expectations become resentment. It doesn't happen overnight, it happens over time, but that means that our repeated inability to be vulnerable is going to cause a problem. Because as much as these tell you what vulnerability does, think about the inverse of every single one of them. If it can build trust, it can also take trust away by not being vulnerable. If it reduces resentment, it can increase resentment by not communicating my vulnerabilities, right? The next one is it makes you safe. It makes you a safe space for others. Kind of like we were talking about in that first one. When you go first with your truth, others feel more free to go next. When we're the first person to do something, it literally says it's okay. You can mirror my emotions here. This is a safe space. Right? And this is so very important in relationships, is that somebody has got to knock down that wall first. And when we realize that, if they're gonna leave me, if they're gonna abandon me, they're gonna do it regardless, because they're gonna find out that truth. And you can never hook somebody enough to make that truth not sink and hurt and do those things. And actually, matter of fact, by not telling them up front, you're making the problem worse. And I'll give you an example of this. Right? So I was dating a woman one time, and she asked me if she looked good in what she was wearing. Men know this one. This is a loaded question, right, guys? Well, what ended up happening is I said, you know what? That doesn't look the greatest on you. I would rather see you in something else, right? And she asked me afterwards, she was like, I've never had somebody actually tell me I didn't look good in something. I said, well, here's the problem. I said, we're going out to dinner tonight with your best friend and her husband. Okay. It was a double date thing. And I sat there and I thought about it, and I was like, if I tell her the wrong thing, if I tell her she looks great, even though I don't think she looks good at all in what she's wearing, she's going to keep that outfit on because she bought it and she wants the validation, right? We're going to go out. Then her friend is going to say, hey, bathroom now. And she's be like, oh, your husband let you leave the house like that? Oh my God, it's terrible looking, right? And then you're going to get mad at me for not telling the truth, right? As harsh as that vulnerability is to say, I don't like this, it fosters actual truth, and it fosters a great relationship later. By not telling the truth, I'm actually prolonging what's coming anyways. The truth is going to come out, and now you're not only mad at me because I didn't tell the truth, you're mad at me because you don't look good either, and you feel ashamed and embarrassed. So I would rather create one negative emotion than create multiple negative emotions by trying to mask what's really going on and then the truth coming out later. Okay. So I always say vulnerability and authenticity is always best if you want that person to stay. If you want them for temporary, that's fine. You're never going to be able to get them to suddenly not see that thing later once it comes out. Okay. So why do people refuse to be vulnerable then? Knowing all of this, knowing what it does do for a relationship, why do we still go down this path of not being vulnerable? It's pretty common things that you're going to hear here. Something that most of these I talk about on a regular basis and the effects of it, but we rarely talk about the effects on vulnerability of a lot of these things, right? Despite all this power that we know of, the first one is fear of rejection. Opening up means risking not being accepted. That right there says it all. We don't want to open up because we fear that person to be like, you're stupid, you're not this, you're not that. Whatever reason that fear of rejection is there, right? It still means that I'm putting myself out there in a manner that says I might be rejected or abandoned by saying this, or I might be ridiculed or mocked even, right? But it's always that fear of rejection, so to speak. And rejection is one of the most painful emotional experiences a person can face, right? For someone with attachment wounds or abandonment trauma, being vulnerable can feel like walking into a fire at that point, because we are asking for trouble by being vulnerable. I've been vulnerable in the past, and I've been rejected and abandoned for it. And so now I have to go back and do the same thing with a new person, and it can feel like absolutely excruciating at that point. Okay. So another example of this is I told someone I loved them once and they ghosted me. That memory becomes a warning sign for every future opportunity to be real. So if I have been rejected, like dating a person for 3 months, and I say, "Hey, I love you," and they're like, okay," and we go through that night, and then I never hear from them again, then now I fear being open. But what we have to realize is that's not going to happen with everybody. That vulnerability was me talking to a person that was going to leave probably anyways at any point in time, and they're just doing it earlier. The turd flushed itself is what I like to say, right? If the turd wants to flush itself, let it flush itself. Let them leave now as opposed to leaving later, because the later you go, the more it's going to hurt when they do leave. So I would rather them leave early and often than leave later once I become attached when they find out the truth, because I wasn't vulnerable to begin with. And it's always best to be vulnerable early than it is to be vulnerable later, if that makes sense. Another reason why this happens and we refuse to be vulnerable is because childhood conditioning. If we grew up in an environment where expressing emotion led to punishment, ridicule, or neglect, your nervous system kind of learned early that emotions equal danger, right? Stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. I know I can't tell you how many people I have heard, have repeated that phrase. We hear it all the time in movies even, and for a lot of us that grew up in the 80s and 90s, you'll hear that one even earlier obviously too, but for me being a kid that grew up in the 80s and 90s, I'll give you something to cry about, right? That meant that if I feel something, I'm not allowed to feel it because they don't like the feeling of that emotion. So I'm being rejected essentially in a way. And that childhood conditioning creates that fear, even if we don't know it and name it as a fear. That's what it's doing to us. It's telling us that emotions equal danger, so do not share, right? Or we hear the old toughen up, right? Or don't be dramatic about things. We need to allow those children to feel the things that they feel, but then ask them questions to guide them through those emotions so that they arrive at logic, not stem off their emotions to teach them that emotions are bad. If we teach a child to be expressive with their emotions and to regulate their emotions, eventually they'll come around to their own truths and they'll start doing it faster. But when we try to make them suppress those emotions, it creates childhood conditioning, which now they can't be vulnerable in the future, which is going to then affect downline every relationship they're in from that point forward. Okay. So we talk about childhood trauma always being a problem anyways, but it can really stem off a child from being vulnerable when they need to be, when it's time to be in a loving and safe relationship, that they don't even recognize that it's safe because emotions themselves inside of them are unsafe in their mind. So no matter how safe that other person looks, no matter how much they mirror the emotions, if we've been conditioned as a child, then we'll never get to that point, right? It leads to internalized shame, essentially being, expressing our vulnerabilities, our needs, our wants, our desires, our emotions, all of that stuff. It becomes this shameful act, so to speak. And again, as we grow up later on in life, it really hinders us from connecting deeply and intimately with partners, right? It can be a control mechanism to not be vulnerable. Vulnerability invites uncertainty. Again, when we aren't sure of the outcome of sharing a detail about ourselves, we then have this view that it's uncertainty. Uncertainty is extremely uncomfortable for everybody. In my 7-day fast I'm going through right now, it is prompted by a lot of uncertainty in my life. And as I'm asking God for answers and He's not giving me any more answers at times, I sit there and I say, like, oh my gosh, it's the most uncomfortable, excruciating feeling sitting there in silence, not having answers on which direction you need to go, but asking the questions of somebody, right? That uncertainty is extremely uncomfortable, especially for those that use control as a survival mechanism. When you open up, you can't control how someone will react. And that's terrifying for people who fear being powerless, right? Examples of this, there's someone who dominates every conversation might actually be trying to avoid being asked personal questions. They are so afraid of being vulnerable that they will dictate the conversation so that way it steers clear of what they don't want to admit, the things they don't want to talk about. They dominate conversations a lot. A lot of times too, when I talk to people that are in the dating phase, right? And they go on a date with a guy that just talks about himself the whole time, right? And they're like, well, he's not trying to not be vulnerable. No, no, he actually is trying to not be vulnerable by doing that. Because what he's afraid of a lot of times is he'll ask you a question, you'll state something, and a lot of times if your response is in any way, shape, or form vulnerable, he's going to feel like that's prompting him to answer the same question. So he doesn't want to ask questions. He wants to control the narrative, control the conversation, so that way it does not steer into any territory that's going to be vulnerable to him. So when he talks about things, a lot of times that person that talks a lot about themselves are talking superficial things. They're not talking depth. They're not talking anything about anything vulnerable in any way, shape, or form. And as people look at those conversations, they're like, you're right. He never talked about anything that really was a vulnerability. It was always bragging on himself because he's trying to steer clear of all of those things that are vulnerable to him. Okay, so it can be a control mechanism. That's not a healthy thing, right? But that's why people won't want to be vulnerable, because if they control things, they don't have to be vulnerable. Right. There's the next one is a fear of weaponization, right? Many people have had their past pain used against them, especially manipulative or abusive relationships. Being vulnerable starts to feel like handing someone the gun, right? And expecting them not to shoot you. And you're like, well, then I'm just not going to hand them the gun in the first place, right? And this can happen when, you do open up and you're vulnerable and you say, I've been cheated on in the past and blah 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 blah. And so when that partner is hurt, they go out and cheat on you to try to get you to do what they want to do. They have now weaponized the cheating against you, or they make you fear that they are cheating. Perfect example of this is in a controlling or manipulative relationship. If they have asked you, what your biggest fears are, and you're like, I'm fear of being cheated on before, of being cheated on because I've been cheated on before. They're not necessarily going to cheat, but what they're going to do is they're going to create that illusion in your mind that they are. They may become distant. They may turn their phone upside down all of a sudden, and they may not actually be even talking to somebody. But in a controlling and manipulative relationship, they're going to see that vulnerability, and they're going to exploit that by creating that doubt in you that makes that fear intensify. They are now weaponizing your fear against you. Okay? And so in abusive relationships, it happens more often than not. In controlling relationships, it happens more often than not. But it is a reason why people will not be vulnerable, because they're like, the last time I did this person weaponized it against me in some way, shape, or form. Okay. So just yet another reason why. Another big one for people that find themselves in patterns, like we end up in the same, it feels like we're in the same relationship, but the person has a different face, right? Or a different hair color, but they act the same. It's because dysfunction feels similar, right? So vulnerability, that dysfunction of not sharing feels familiar. So if emotional distance or defensiveness was the norm in your early relationships, openness may feel foreign or unsafe. You may not feel like, even if they share their details of their life, you're like, I can't share mine because that dysfunction was normal to me in growing up, right? Or in early on relationships. You might not even realize you're avoiding vulnerability because suppression feels like protection, right? So you may even feel safe by not being vulnerable, and being vulnerable feels horribly unsafe. So it creates this dysfunction that your brain has now got a narrative inside that says sharing is not right and protecting myself is right. That is dysfunction because it is actually not healthy. Being vulnerable with somebody that you want to connect with is a healthy behavior. It is not healthy to hold back the truth in order to try to get somebody to stay. Again, it's manipulation. Okay? Like, the analogy here for this one is that it's like wearing a heavy coat in summer. You're sweating and uncomfortable, but you can't imagine taking it off because it's all you've ever known. So if you don't know any better, then taking the coat off is going to feel uncomfortable in many, many ways. Okay? So that dysfunction feels super familiar to you. Number 6 here, on the reasons why people fear being vulnerable, is confusing vulnerability with exposure. Some people believe vulnerability means total exposure, when in reality it's about intentional honesty. They avoid being real because they assume it means being raw or messy in front of everyone. I can stand in my truth that's vulnerable without getting like emotionally dysregulated. A lot of people see a woman, say, crying about past things that have happened to her as being messy and nasty, and now they've equated that with vulnerability. So they think that if they have to be vulnerable, they're gonna have to cry, they're gonna have to do this, they're gonna have to show emotions, and it really, it means that they are looking at it as exposure. Whereas when you stand in your truth, Again, this is overwhelming and I'm not ready to talk about it. That's vulnerable and standing in your truth without being messy, nasty, disgusting, or anything. We don't have to expose anything to be vulnerable. Just to let somebody know that you're hurting is enough to be vulnerable without having to expose anything, right? And then dictating with the relationship, what kind of relationship we're in, can dictate whether or not I am more open with that vulnerability and I tell them more about it. But typically, the best thing you can do is just be vulnerable enough to say, I am overwhelmed, I am hurting, I'm this, I'm that. I don't need to talk about it any further. Right? Vulnerability is selective. It's not about undressing your soul for everyone. It's about offering access to those who've earned it. So we have to build trust to get vulnerability, and vulnerability then builds more trust. So if we imagine, if I want trust to increase, I have to slowly increase my vulnerability, and they kind of walk hand in hand. The more trust they get from me, the more vulnerable I can be with them. The more vulnerable I get with them, the more trust they build. The more trust they build, the more they are stepping stones that kind of, ratchet each other up as they go. So it's very important that we need to be selective with who we're vulnerable with, and not just be vulnerable with anyone. Because again, being vulnerable with everyone is looking for something in return. That's why we're doing it. We're looking for pity, empathy, sympathy, whatever you want to call it. Shame and identity is another reason why people are going to shy away from vulnerability, right? If someone believes their emotional needs make them too much, right, or not enough, they'll bury those needs under perfectionism, people pleasing, or hyper independence. Right? I don't need anybody. That's actually shame, saying that I cannot be vulnerable because if I do, right, I'm going to be too much. And so they become hyper independent, or if they have to ask for something, they become hyper independent because they have shame in the whole concept of asking for help. Like we talked about earlier, with that being a way that vulnerability comes out, is we say, I need help. The hyper independent is the opposite of that because they feel shame in asking for help. So shame and their identity is attached to whatever it is, right? The hyper independence is a perfect one. They say, well, I don't need a man, I want a man. No, you don't want, you actually don't want a man. You're repelling men. You're bringing in boys because of the way you're acting. By acting hyper independent, that's saying that I have shame and guilt around my abilities and needing somebody else. But in all honesty, a relationship is two people leaning on each other, and you need to have both people leaning in before it's going to work, right? If a person is a people pleaser, they're going to use the identity that I'm just a nice person, I'm a kind person, I'm compassionate, I'm a doer, I like to fix things, I like to help. That's the identity talking. That is not truth talking at that point, because we are people pleasers. We are identifying with the good feeling we have, because people pleasing, I say it all the time, people pleasing is a manipulative tactic that a wounded person uses. And why do I say that? Because what it is it's prompting a thank you and appreciation. It's prompting something from the other person. It's prompting them to, even them always relying on you, you like that feeling and it's validating you. And that's why we do it. But then when we try to overhelp or people please, we're doing it from a place of trying to prompt them into some sort of response towards ourselves. And that's where the danger is. So when our identity is attached to things like people pleasing, or our identity is attached to hyper independence, it's a reason to not be vulnerable. And we're gonna exploit that thing that we do and use that as the mask for the vulnerability that's behind it. I'm afraid to say that I need somebody. I'm afraid that they're not going to like me if I don't please them. But what that's doing is prompting them to do things for us. In all honesty, it's, people pleasing is prompting somebody else to give us some sort of validation. Okay, so that's all the reasons why people are going to refuse to be vulnerable: fear of rejection, childhood conditioning, control mechanisms, fear of weaponization, dysfunction feeling similar, confusion, vulnerability with exposure, and that shame and identity. So why overall, if we're going to kind of sum this up into one big thing, why is vulnerability so powerful then? Well, first off, I realize that it's going to build trust, and I need that to have a relationship. Some people say I can't trust anybody. You got to build it, and to build it, you have to be vulnerable. There's no other way around it. But again, it's like a dimmer switch. It is not an on-off switch. I've got to slowly build it. So again, we build them up as ratcheting things: vulnerable, trust, vulnerable, trust, vulnerable, trust, so on and so forth. Maybe trust goes first, then vulnerability. It doesn't matter. but it's going to build that trust, right? So it's a powerful way and a powerful tool to build trust. Because as I open up little vulnerable things about me, like let's take the vulnerabilities on a scale as well. I can tell them about, say the trauma I've been through with my TBI and my PTSD. That's like a high up there kind of vulnerability. But I can also tell them things that I'm a little bit vulnerable about, like my ears, or the fact that I've got lipomas all over my abdomen, right? Those are low vulnerability. I share those first to see how they react to those things and how they carry the weight of those small vulnerabilities to know whether it's safe for me to open up for the big vulnerabilities. So we see them both as like sliders that slowly increase over time, but they've got to kind of go hand in hand. Trust might go first, then vulnerability, or vulnerability might go first and then trust. But either way, they have to play off each other. And that's why it's so powerful, because it builds that trust, right? It's going to deepen intimacy. So no matter how close you feel to somebody, the more vulnerable you are, the more exposed you are. But that means that when they do accept you, you feel closer to them. That's how it builds that intimacy. You cannot connect without being seen. It's impossible. You're going to have, you find this in relationships, like I feel like I'm just living with a best friend, because you're not actually being vulnerable in any way, shape, or form. You're not being vulnerable, so you're not being intimate. You're close, but you're not having true intimacy, the deep intimacy that really is cultivated by being vulnerable, right? And it sparks courage in others. That's why it's so powerful, right? Vulnerability is contagious. The more somebody else is vulnerable, and I'll be the first to attest to it, the more vulnerable I'm on my page, the more super open, raw, vulnerable messages I get from people. One of the most common things I hear in coaching, in texting, and whatnot with fans, followers, clients, with everybody is you're just so easy to talk to. Because I'm being vulnerable first. I am actually opening the door to saying I am that safe space by sharing some of the most vulnerable, raw, guttural things that I've been in my life, and not looking to you for any pity, any sympathy, any empathy for what I've been through. I am stating it as a fact and as of truth, and not worrying about whether or not you are actually going to accept me. And by doing that, it opens the door for you. So it sparks that courage in others to say it is okay to be vulnerable. And no one, even if they don't, even if they don't accept me, it's going to be okay, because I see this other person doing it, right? So some real world examples is a leader saying, "I'm nervous too," before a big pitch in the sales room, right? And he's the leader of this team that's going to have this sales pitch for this marketing campaign, and everyone's nervous, and he walks and he says, "I'm nervous too. It's going to be okay. We're going to take a deep breath together." Right? Being vulnerable then brings the team together, and the team actually does better in that thing, because now they're looking to their leader, that they're like, "Oh man, this man is he's stoic. I need to be like him." When in actuality, he's just as vulnerable and just as scared as you are. Now it brings him to your level. Now you can work better with that person, because we're sparking that kind of courage, right? Another real world example is a partner saying, "I'm afraid of losing you." It leads to honest healing, connection, not control, right? Instead of the reverse of that, instead of saying I'm afraid of losing you, you're saying, "Yeah, you just go do whatever you want," right? That we project out this random thing, like, I know you're gonna want me gone, right? Instead of saying I'm afraid to lose you, right? We mask it behind something else. So it's gonna deepen that intimacy by telling someone, "I'm afraid of losing you." Right? That deepens the trust, because then they're like, "Okay, well, I'm afraid to lose you too. I don't want to lose. Let's." It then takes the defenses down and says, "Let's actually work on this together." Okay, so how do we practice that safe vulnerability? Right? We share from the scar, not the open wound, unless the space is safe. Right? So before you share, is this about connection, or am I trying to offload? Think about that before we share. We're going to say again, before we share something with somebody, is this about connection, or am I trying to offload? In this example, this is something I've worked through and I want to share with you, versus I'm breaking down and need someone to catch me. So again, if it's about connection, this is something I've worked through and I want to share it with you. The person that is not doing it from an emotional availability standpoint, and they're just venting to try to have somebody catch them, and it's from an open wound, they're saying, "I'm breaking down and I need someone to catch me." That is not being vulnerable. That is emotionally diarrhea on somebody and expecting them to clean themselves up off afterwards. That does not foster any form of trust, any form of intimacy, or anything. It is literally just dumping on them, right? We can use "I feel" statements instead of blame, right? And this comes out a lot. "I feel disconnected and I want to feel closer," as opposed to saying, "You never pay attention to me." You never pay attention to me is a projecting statement. If we think of anytime somebody says you blah 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 blah, that is projection. And it typically and once you start realizing this little life hack right here, where when somebody says you need to do this, what they're actually saying is they're either actively doing it or they just got done actively doing it and they're working through it, but it's still projection at that point. They see the world through their lens, and what you're doing it reminds them of themselves. That's why they're saying you do this. So when we stick to I statements, we do not project, because projection statements always create defensiveness. So we are going to accept what hurts, so to speak, and say I feel disconnected and I want to feel closer, because that is vulnerable. It's saying I feel disconnected and I don't want to feel disconnected, right? And that feels weakness, almost like we're saying we have a need that's not being met, and we don't like doing that because it makes me feel weak to need somebody, right? So again, not using projecting you statements and using I statements. Another way we can do this is accept discomfort as a sign you're growing. Vulnerability feels risky, and that's how you know it's real, right? If it feels risky. So pause and ask yourself, am I uncomfortable because I'm unsafe or because I'm being honest? Right? And if we look at it like that and we say, am I being uncomfortable because it's unsafe? If it truly is unsafe, then don't share. If it is not, if the situation is safe, then it means that you're being uncomfortable because you have to grow into this being truthful and being honest right here. Okay? So accept that discomfort. Repair when it's not imperfect or when it's not perfect. You will overshare and you're going to shut down at times. I'm not saying that because you are being vulnerable that you're not going to have these moments where you do brain dump and you overshare and you verbally diarrhea onto somebody. But when we are in a place of true vulnerability, we repair it. Remember we were talking about earlier with, I screwed up. I want to fix this, right? This is where repair does that, right? We repair as a way of saying, I'm sorry for my actions in this, and that is vulnerable. It's using vulnerability actually as the repair for a place where we weren't vulnerable in the first place, if that makes any sense. And then the last way we kind of help to foster is we create rituals of vulnerability. Don't wait until a crisis. Build a rhythm of emotional honesty. I talked about it last week, doing weekly check-ins with friends, with partners, having a time to sit down and discuss hard things like that. Journaling or voice notes to share thoughts without confrontation. Like I can have a journal, like sits in the kitchen or whatever, and every time I'm having a frustrated moment or I want to share vulnerable things, I can write it in the journal and allow them to read and respond at their own leisure. I'm not putting an expectation. When we text people, as weird as it sounds, it creates an expectation. When I write it in a journal, let's say set on a kitchen table where we can both read it, it allows that person to come to it when they're ready to come to it, and there's no expectation, because I'm like, okay, well, they may not read it and they can't respond right now because I'm going to work and they're going to work, and but they may have responded, but I can't even read it till I get back from work. So it takes the expectation off by doing that. Okay. But that's all I got for you guys. I just want to say that real is rare these days, but it's becoming more of the normal for a lot of people. And I tell you, you need to make sure that you're being vulnerable if you want to build a true, like, deep, intimate, emotionally honest relationship. You're never going to get there. You can't expect someone to love all of you if you don't show them all of you. You know what I mean? Like, you've got to give them everything you have, the good, the bad, the ugly, the indifferent. The right people will stay, the wrong people will leave. And that's okay. We can let them leave. That doesn't mean it's not going to be painful, but it just means that when somebody stays, they're staying for the right reasons. If you make somebody stay because you don't show them the real stuff, then they're not going to stay when they finally see the real stuff, because they're holding on to a version of you that you actually are not, right? And at that point, it's a lie. I know people don't like to be called liars, but if you're not being authentic, you're lying. You're lying to yourself and you're lying to them. And that creates a bait and switch. So if you want deep relationships, you have to be open, you have to be honest, and you have to be vulnerable. But as we talked about, we don't just go open full, take out all stops and go crazy, right? It means that we judge that vulnerability and engage like a dimmer switch. Hopefully that makes sense to y'all. If you have any questions, let me know. Send me a message on Instagram or on Facebook. I will be getting to last week's live. Still needs to get posted on the YouTube. This one will get posted hopefully tomorrow. I've been really, really busy this week in a lot of meditation stuff with Christ, as far as the 7-day fast I'm in. Looking for some answers on the next step for my business and where I'm going now. The book is done, book is released, doing great. Looking for that next step, looking for God to guide me. But other than that, hope everybody has a great finish to your weekend. Be looking for this one and last week's on YouTube here probably tomorrow. Other than that, stay safe, keep the faith, and never let him grind you down. Thanks, guys.